They say children should be seen and not heard, that adults always know best. But what happens when brilliant young minds challenge the so-called experts and prove them spectacularly wrong? Today, we're sharing 7 incredible stories of kids who didn't just think outside the box, they completely shattered it. From exposing million-dollar scams to solving problems that stumped PhD scientists, these young geniuses left adults speechless with their intelligence, creativity, and sheer determination. These aren't just feel-good stories. They're proof that age doesn't determine wisdom, and sometimes the most profound insights come from the most unexpected sources. If these stories inspire you, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because we have many more incredible tales of underdogs who changed the world. Let's start with a story that will blow your mind. Our journey takes us to Portland, Oregon, where 9-year-old Emma Rodriguez was helping her grandmother sort through her weekly medications. Emma's grandmother, Maria, had been taking expensive prescription drugs for her arthritis, medications that cost the family nearly $800 a month. But Emma noticed something strange. The pills looked identical to the vitamin supplements her mother bought at the grocery store for $12 a bottle. Same size, same color, even the same markings. When Emma pointed this out to her family, the adults dismissed her observation. "Honey, prescription medications are completely different from vitamins," her mother explained patiently. "The doctors know what they're doing." But Emma wasn't satisfied. Using her school's computer lab, she researched the active ingredients in both medications. What she discovered shocked her, and would soon shock the entire medical community. The prescription arthritis medication contained the exact same compounds as the over-the-counter supplement, just with different packaging and a 3,000% markup. Emma had accidentally uncovered a massive pharmaceutical pricing scandal. Her findings, initially shared with her school science teacher, eventually reached investigative journalists. The resulting investigation exposed how certain pharmaceutical companies were repackaging common supplements as expensive prescription drugs, targeting elderly patients who trusted their doctor's recommendations without question. Emma's discovery led to a class action lawsuit that recovered over $40 million for affected patients. The pharmaceutical company was forced to pay substantial penalties and change their practices. When asked about her discovery, Emma simply said, "I just looked at the pills and thought they looked the same. Adults always tell us to ask questions, so I did." The adults who had dismissed her concerns? They learned that sometimes the most important observations come from the most innocent eyes. But Emma wasn't the only child to shock the experts. In the prestigious halls of Cambridge University, mathematics professors had been wrestling with a complex theorem for over a century. In the prestigious halls of Cambridge University, mathematics professors had been wrestling with a complex theorem for over a century. The Whitmore conjecture, named after the mathematician who first proposed it in 1924, had stumped some of the brightest minds in academia. Then 12-year-old Marcus Chen walked into their lives. Marcus wasn't even supposed to be at the university. His older sister was attending a summer mathematics camp, and their parents had brought Marcus along to the campus tour. While his sister participated in advanced calculus workshops, Marcus wandered into a lecture hall where Professor Elizabeth Harrison was explaining the Whitmore conjecture to graduate students. The professor was detailing why the problem remained unsolved, drawing complex equations on the whiteboard. That's when Marcus raised his small hand from the back of the room. "Excuse me," he said politely, "but couldn't you just flip the equation and work backwards from the conclusion?" The room fell silent. Graduate students turned to stare at this child who had wandered into their advanced mathematics discussion. Professor Harrison's first instinct was to gently explain why the problem wasn't that simple. But something about Marcus's suggestion nagged at her. That evening, she worked through his proposed approach. By midnight, she realized that this 12-year-old had solved a problem that had eluded mathematicians for nearly 100 years. Marcus's solution was elegant in its simplicity. He had approached the problem without the preconceived notions that had limited adult mathematicians. While experts had been trying increasingly complex solutions, Marcus saw a straightforward path that everyone else had overlooked. The mathematical community was astounded. Marcus became the youngest person ever to have a theorem named after him. The Chen solution to the Whitmore conjecture is now taught in universities worldwide. When interviewed by academic journals, Marcus shrugged and said, "I just thought about it like a puzzle. Sometimes when you can't solve a puzzle one way, you try turning it around." The professors who had spent decades on the problem? They learned that fresh perspectives often come from minds unclouded by traditional thinking. Speaking of fresh perspectives, let me tell you about 8-year-old Aisha Patel, who had spent countless hours in hospitals. 8-year-old Aisha Patel had spent countless hours in hospitals. Born with a heart condition that required regular monitoring, she was intimately familiar with medical equipment that most children never see. During one of her routine checkups, Aisha watched as nurses struggled with the IV monitoring system. The current design required nurses to manually check readings every 30 minutes, often waking sleeping patients and disrupting their recovery. "Why doesn't it just tell you when something's wrong?" Aisha asked her nurse, Jennifer. Jennifer explained that while the machines could detect problems, they weren't designed to communicate effectively with the nursing station. The technology existed, but connecting different systems was complicated. That night, Aisha couldn't stop thinking about the problem. She had seen similar issues with her gaming devices at home, different systems that couldn't talk to each other until someone figured out how to connect them. Using her basic understanding of how her tablet connected to their home Wi-Fi, Aisha drew up a simple diagram showing how hospital machines could send alerts directly to nurses' devices. Her father, an engineer, initially smiled at his daughter's cute drawing. But as he studied her diagram more carefully, he realized Aisha had identified a fundamental flaw in hospital communication systems. Her solution was not only technically feasible, but potentially revolutionary. Working with Aisha, her father contacted the hospital's technical team. Within 6 months, they had developed a prototype based on Aisha's concept. The system allowed real-time monitoring of patients without constant physical checks, improving both patient rest and nursing efficiency. The innovation was so successful that it's now being implemented in hospitals across the country. The system has reduced nursing workload by 30%, while improving patient satisfaction scores significantly. Aisha's solution saved hospitals millions of dollars in efficiency improvements and, more importantly, enhanced patient care for thousands of people. When medical technology companies tried to buy her design, Aisha insisted that any profits be used to provide free medical care for other children with heart conditions. The hospital administrators who had initially dismissed her questions? They learned that sometimes the best innovations come from those who understand problems firsthand. And speaking of understanding problems firsthand, you won't believe what 10-year-old David Kim discovered at his grandfather's grocery store. 10-year-old David Kim loved math almost as much as he loved his grandfather's small grocery store. Every weekend, David helped his grandfather, Mr. Kim, with inventory and basic bookkeeping for the family business. The store had been struggling financially, barely breaking even despite steady customer traffic. Mr. Kim couldn't understand why his profits were so low when sales seemed good. David noticed something odd about their supplier invoices. The grocery distributor, Mega Fresh Corp., charged different prices for identical products depending on the delivery date. Sometimes milk cost $3 per gallon, sometimes $4.50, with no apparent pattern. When David pointed this out to his grandfather, Mr. Kim explained that wholesale prices fluctuated based on market conditions. "It's complicated business, David. Adults understand these things." But David's mathematical mind couldn't accept the randomness. He created a spreadsheet tracking all their orders for 6 months, looking for patterns in the pricing variations. What he discovered was shocking. MegaFresh was systematically overcharging small businesses while providing the same products to large supermarket chains at significantly lower prices. The price variations weren't based on market conditions. They were based on the supplier's assumption that small business owners wouldn't notice or wouldn't have the resources to fight back. David's analysis revealed that his grandfather's store was being overcharged by nearly 40% compared to the rates offered to larger customers for identical products. Armed with David's spreadsheet evidence, Mr. Kim contacted other small business owners in their community. They discovered that dozens of family-owned stores were victims of the same pricing scheme. The evidence was so clear and well-organized that it caught the attention of the state attorney general's office. David's mathematical analysis became the cornerstone of a major investigation into discriminatory pricing practices. The resulting lawsuit against Mega Fresh Corp resulted in a $50 million settlement for affected small businesses. The company was forced to implement transparent, uniform pricing policies and faced ongoing regulatory oversight. David's grandfather's store received a settlement check for over $80,000, enough to renovate the shop and secure its future for years to come. The corporate executives who had designed the discriminatory pricing scheme, they learned that sometimes the most damaging evidence comes from the most unexpected sources. David, now known in his community as the kid who took down the big corporation, simply said, "The numbers didn't make sense, so I made a chart. Math doesn't lie." But David wasn't the only young person to notice what adults had missed. At Roosevelt Elementary, 11-year-old Maya Washington had always been fascinated by emergency procedures. 11-year-old Maya Washington had always been fascinated by emergency procedures. At Roosevelt Elementary, she noticed that fire drills were chaotic, with students confused about routes and teachers struggling to account for everyone quickly. During a particularly disorganized drill, Maya timed how long it took for her class to evacuate: 12 minutes. She had learned in her safety education that fires could spread through a building in less than 5 minutes. That night, Maya studied her school's floor plan and identified the problem. The evacuation routes were designed by adults who didn't understand how children actually moved through the building. The official evacuation plan required students to exit through main hallways, creating bottlenecks at doorways. But Maya knew that students naturally moved toward side exits and outdoor areas they were familiar with from recess and lunch. Using colored pencils and graph paper, Maya redesigned the evacuation routes based on natural student movement patterns. Her plan utilized multiple smaller exits instead of funneling everyone through main doors. She also proposed a simple color-coding system for different grades, with each grade assigned specific routes marked by colored tape that even kindergarteners could follow without reading. When Maya presented her plan to the principal, Mrs. Foster initially praised her creativity, but explained that evacuation procedures were designed by professional safety experts and couldn't be changed by students. But Maya persisted. She asked if they could test her routes during the next practice drill, just to see if her timing estimates were accurate. The results were remarkable. Using Maya's system, the entire school evacuated in under 4 minutes, a 66% improvement in speed. More importantly, the evacuation was calmer and more organized, reducing the risk of panic-related injuries. Word of Maya's innovation spread to other schools in the district. Safety consultants studied her approach and discovered that traditional evacuation plans often ignored the psychological and physical realities of how children respond to emergencies. Maya's child-centered design principles are now incorporated into safety protocols at over 300 schools across the state. Her approach has been published in national safety journals and is taught in emergency management courses. The safety experts who had initially dismissed her suggestions, they learned that sometimes the best solutions come from understanding the actual experience of the people you're trying to protect. Maya was invited to speak at the National School Safety Conference, where she told an audience of adults, "You have to think about how kids really act, not how you want them to act. We're not small adults, we're kids." Her presentation received a standing ovation from safety professionals, who realized they had been designing systems for theoretical children rather than real ones. Maya's success reminds us that the best solutions often come from understanding reality rather than theory. 9-year-old Carlos Mendoza understood this better than anyone. 9-year-old Carlos Mendoza loved fishing with his father in the river that ran through their small town of Cedar Valley. But lately, Carlos noticed that fewer fish were visible in the water. and those they caught seemed smaller and less healthy. When Carlos mentioned this to his father, he was told that fish populations naturally fluctuated and not to worry about it. But Carlos was a curious child who paid attention to details. He started keeping a fishing journal, noting the number and size of fish caught on each trip. The data showed a clear decline over the past year. Carlos also noticed that the water looked different, slightly cloudier than he remembered. At school, Carlos shared his observations with his science teacher, Miss Rodriguez. She helped him research possible causes for declining fish populations, including pollution, temperature changes, and chemical contamination. Carlos decided to test the water quality using a simple kit from the science classroom. The results showed elevated levels of chemicals typically found in industrial runoff. But Cedar Valley was a farming community with no major industries. Where could industrial chemicals be coming from? Carlos expanded his investigation, testing water samples from different points along the river. He discovered that contamination levels were highest near the town's water treatment facility. Using online maps and his own observations, Carlos traced the contamination to a small manufacturing plant that had recently opened just upstream from the town. The plant produced agricultural fertilizers and was supposed to treat all wastewater before releasing it into the river. Carlos's father was skeptical. The plant had all the proper permits and was regularly inspected by environmental officials. Surely a 9-year-old couldn't detect pollution that trained inspectors had missed. But Carlos's data was compelling. He had documented contamination levels over time, showing a clear correlation between the plant's operation and declining water quality. With his teacher's help, Carlos submitted his findings to the State Environmental Protection Agency. Initially, officials were dismissive of a report filed by an elementary school student. However, the quality of Carlos's data and the consistency of his testing methodology impressed the investigators. They conducted their own comprehensive water quality assessment and discovered that Carlos was absolutely correct. The fertilizer plant had been illegally dumping partially treated wastewater, violating environmental regulations and contaminating the town's water supply. The contamination hadn't been detected during routine inspections because officials only tested at designated points, missing the specific area where Carlos had identified the problem. The plant was forced to install proper water treatment systems and pay substantial fines. More importantly, they had to fund a complete cleanup of the contaminated river section. Carlos's vigilance not only saved the local fish population, but protected the drinking water for over 8,000 residents of Cedar Valley. The environmental officials who had initially doubted his report, they learned that sometimes the most important environmental monitoring comes from people who actually live with and observe nature daily. Carlos was honored by the state's Environmental Protection Agency and invited to participate in their youth environmental monitoring program. When asked about his achievement, Carlos said simply, "I just wanted to keep fishing with my dad. You have to pay attention to notice when things change." Carlos's story shows us the power of careful observation. But our final story proves that sometimes a fresh perspective can revolutionize entire systems. Let me tell you about 12-year-old Zoe Thompson. Our final story takes us to Miami International Airport, where 12-year-old Zoe Thompson was traveling alone to visit her grandmother. As an experienced young traveler, Zoe was familiar with airport security procedures. But during this particular trip, Zoe noticed something that troubled her. The security screening process was creating dangerous bottlenecks, with hundreds of passengers crowded together in confined spaces before going through metal detectors. Zoe had learned about crowd dynamics in her social studies class when studying historical disasters. She recognized that the current security layout created exactly the kind of dangerous crowd concentration that emergency management experts tried to avoid. While waiting in the security line, Zoe observed passenger flow patterns and identified the bottleneck points. She realized that the problem wasn't the speed of individual screenings. It was the layout of the waiting area that forced too many people into too small a space. During her flight, Zoe sketched out an alternative security layout that would distribute crowds more evenly and reduce dangerous concentrations of people. Her design used multiple parallel screening lines instead of a single funnel system. When Zoe returned home, she shared her observations with her father, a logistics engineer. He was impressed by her analysis, but explained that airport security was designed by federal experts who understood complex safety requirements. But Zoe persisted. She researched airport security protocols and discovered that her concerns about crowd safety were shared by security professionals. Several incidents at other airports had highlighted the vulnerability created by large crowds in confined screening areas. With her father's help, Zoe contacted the Transportation Security Administration with her suggestions. Her detailed analysis and proposed solutions caught the attention of TSA officials who were already looking for ways to improve both security and passenger flow. Zoe's design principles were tested at a smaller regional airport where they reduced wait times by 40% while improving overall security by eliminating dangerous crowd concentrations. The success led to a broader implementation of Zoe's concepts across multiple airports. Her approach is now part of the standard TSA training manual for security checkpoint design. The federal security experts who had initially questioned whether a 12-year-old could contribute to airport security, they learned that fresh perspectives often identify problems that experts have become blind to through familiarity. Zoe was invited to speak at the International Airport Security Conference and was awarded the TSA's Civilian Recognition Award, the youngest person ever to receive this honor. When interviewed by aviation security magazines, Zoe explained, "I've been through a lot of airports, and I just noticed that the lines felt dangerous. Sometimes when you're not the expert, you can see things that experts miss because they're thinking about different problems." Her insight led to security improvements that protect millions of travelers every year. These 7 young heroes prove that age is no barrier to brilliance. From exposing pharmaceutical fraud to revolutionizing airport security, these kids didn't just think differently, they thought better. What made them special wasn't superior intelligence or advanced education. It was their willingness to question what adults accepted as normal, their fresh perspectives unclouded by conventional thinking, and their courage to speak up when they noticed something wrong. Emma Rodriguez saw identical pills and asked why one cost 60 times more than the other. Marcus Chen looked at a century-old math problem and suggested trying it backwards. Aisha Patel wondered why machines couldn't talk to each other. David Kim noticed that numbers didn't add up. Maya Washington observed that evacuation routes didn't match how children actually moved. Carlos Mendoza paid attention when his fishing spot changed. And Zoe Thompson recognized dangerous crowd patterns that security experts had overlooked. Each of these kids teaches us the same lesson. The most profound insights often come from the most unexpected sources. Sometimes wisdom comes not from experience, but from the absence of assumptions. The next time a child asks you a question that seems obvious or suggests something that sounds impossible, remember these stories. Sometimes the most important breakthroughs happen when we stop explaining why something can't be done and start listening to fresh ideas. These young heroes didn't just outsmart adults, they showed us all how to think more clearly, observe more carefully, and question more bravely. If these stories inspired you, make sure to subscribe for more incredible tales of underdogs who changed the world. And remember, age is just a number, but curiosity is timeless.